Welcome to a Parthian Films blabbercast. Parthian Films, in cooperation with the Snake River Theatrical Plagiarist Guild, is pleased to present the story of the 1927 Plum It Series. This tale is a part of the yet-to-be-released third installment of your Snake River Skirr travel guidebook. Why now, you may ask? Why not wait until the complete book is finally published? Well, the board of the Plagiarist Guild gets quite miffed every year around this time, and now they can take it no longer. And all this is due to the amount of press and general attention that other series gets. Yes, it was 50 years ago this September, but I wonder how many members of the Dominion are aware of the 8 hockey games that took place in September of 1927. The Plum It Series was a mirror of the Canada-Russia series, and was it any better? That will be for you to decide. And as a final caveat/introduction, the Plagiarist Guild wants me to remind everyone that it is true. This is a story. So now, without any further ado, here's my reading of the 27 Plum It Series, the best hockey has to offer. Chapter 1. When Mary and her circus established the village of Snake River, seeking refuge, her little gang was not unique to the Canadian experience. The Dominion openly invited Europeans to head west and establish a new home. Offers of free land and the tools to build this new home were the carrot on the stick. This well-advertised vegetable gave new hope to the hopeless. Behind the poster, the Dominion had a different agenda. The plan was to replace the red man with the white man. Preference would be given to the whites from the British Isles, but any white man was preferred to those that were currently living on the vast prairies. This fact set Mary and her crew apart. They went to live with the current inhabitants, not instead of. Among the settlers in our fair land, there were many who hailed from Eastern Europe. They escaped persecution and looked forward to the freedom that the wide expanse of Saskatchewan offered. Among this number, there was a relatively small group from Minsk. They secured land north of Snake River, and like Mary McCallum and her fellow Snake Riverians, they disappeared. In the scheme of things, the two communities were neighbors. Considering the vast area, the two villages were actually fairly close. However, there was no contact between the two groups until a year after the clowns from Minsk arrived. Purvis Spikes, distillerist extraordinaire. Not counting his years at war, Purvis Spikes had been shot at an even dozen times. He was beaten and robbed more times than he cared to count. He's the only one I know who sleeps with one eye open. Literally. I don't know how he does it. This protective peeper does not even blink. He was constantly on the run from the lawman. That is, until he came to Snake River. Despite an unsure entrance, he is now an essential part of the community. Purvis Spikes is our most productive and famous still operator. Some would say he's got the most important job in the village. It has been said that Spike's sipping liquor number 7 is the grease that lubricates the cogs of industry in Snake River. Only a few would argue the point. Tall and sinewy, with a well-weathered face, his tattoos chronicle a hard life. In all that ink there is only one statement of love. Mom. Spikes is a quiet sort. When he first arrived, he seemed to be built from a bundle of nerves, just ready to explode. I guess being shot at can do that to a man. Before folks got to know him, he was walking past a gaggle of old-timers sitting on a porch. Old Charlie Frackinson commented, "There goes a stick of dynamite." He made the comment regarding Purvis's height and his tightly wound disposition. For a time, the nickname Stick stuck. Stick stuck until they met the man, heard his story, and walked in his shoes for a spell. After that, he was known as Mr. Spikes. He is comfortable now, but it took him a while to settle in. His first stop in Snake River was at Pound Maker's Feed and Seed. He stormed into the store, looking as if he was already planning a getaway. The clerk had long gray hair bound in a ponytail. Despite missing a number of teeth, he greeted Purvis with a welcoming smile. He got up out of his chair behind the counter. "Howdy, neighbor. What can we do you for?" "I got money." "You're new here, ain't you? Well, my name is Old Crow Facing the Wind, but some folks just call me Bob." Spikes cut off the introductions. "I got good money." In order to prove the point, Purvis slammed down a pile of bills on the counter. "Oh, look at all that fancy paper. That's bona fide currency. Graybacks authorized by the Confederate Congress of 1862. What do you want for all that paper?" "Corn." "How much corn?" 200 pounds. Old Crow started to stroke the few lonely hairs dangling off his chin. "By the way, whose picture is that?" Old Crow pointed down at the bills. "That, sir, is Jefferson Davis." "Do tell. Well, how about this, then, friend?" Old Crow sat back down on the office chair behind the counter and motioned for Purvis to take the seat opposite. Purvis declined. "Didn't catch your name, neighbor." "Didn't give it." Old Crow started to rock back and forth on his old wooden chair. The springs that facilitated this rocking motion squeaked out a most annoying tune. Old Crow's gap-toothed grin never changed. Purvis wondered if this was some sort of negotiating tactic. He stared back. It was only then that he noticed Old Crow had one eye all glazed over, all ruminoid gray and glassy. He had a deep scar that ran from his forehead down onto his cheek. Spikes was more than aware of his own scar and the message it sent when he met new folks. His defacement started at his cheek and ran deep underneath his ear. It had been some time since he let his thoughts drift back to the night he got cut. It was in a whorehouse just outside of Knoxville. Purvis stared at Old Crow and wondered what horrors they had shared. In the shadow of such a dark cloud, how could this man produce such a bright smile? "Spikes. Purvis Spikes." "Well, pleased to meet you, Mr. Spikes. Tell you what, I'll give you your corn, but I don't want to take advantage of a newcomer. So how's about this? I either get you 400 pounds of our best corn, or you give me half that pile of paper." Purvis cocked his head. "I don't get it." Old Crow motioned for his new customer to take the chair offered. Purvis finally sat down. If you were watching the process, it was as if he didn't know how the device worked. He sat on the edge of the chair and took a firm grip. Once Purvis was settled in, as he would be, Old Crow explained the deal. Now, seeing as you're new here, it would be disrespectful for me to take advantage of the situation. See, everyone here in the village knows my wife just loves Christmas. She loves putting on a big show. Every year she has the entire family over for dinner. And I'm telling you, the lengths she won't go. Old Crow just shook his head and laughed at the thought. She gets me to start dusting and polishing weeks before the big day. There's a bird on the table as big as a moose, and a mess of food that could feed an army. You know what I'm saying? But it's the little things that make her happy. All the little trinkets. You know how women are. Well, my wife just gets so much joy out of the trifle. You know, the billabot and goo-gaw. She likes to make a fuss, and don't get me started about the decorations on the tree. Basically, we go all fancy pants. Now, I don't mind taking my boots off once a year, if it's to seeing her happy. As I say, it's all the little fancy things that can bring a tear of joy to her eye. Little cotton doilies for under the plates. A special fork for the pickles. Things like that. So when I look at your fancy paper there, I thought about Christmas, and I thought about my wife. I'd like to take your paper, looks about the right size, and put it out to the outhouse. You know, so when a guest has got to go, they can use your fancy paper to clean up with. It's that kind of thing that my wife just loves. Fancy toilet paper. So I say to you, Purvis Spikes, what's that worth? Making a wife happy. I would say a lot more than 400 pounds of corn. Old Crow sat back with another loud squeal from the chair. Purvis Spikes did not take kindly to being had. I wouldn't know. I don't have a wife. Old Crow nodded. Some would count you's a lucky man. Crow waited, and Spikes finally spoke. I told you, I got money. Old Crow sat forward. And I got corn, silos of the stuff. I'm sick with corn. So I think we can do business. The bootlegger was stunned. Ah, hell. What did Jeff Davis ever do for me anyways? Purvis stood and extended his hand. Old Crow stood as well, and the two shook on the deal. Now how would you like that? We got all kinds of bags, but most folks like our 50-pounders. Easier to carry that way. Fine, 50s will do. Spikes didn't look up as he collected back half of the pile of paper. Is there anything else I can do for you? Now Purvis straightened up and stared Old Crow straight in the eye. I need some big metal pots with lids, some copper pipe, some water barrels, a mule and a cart, and some empty bottles. You got a problem with that? Only a minor issue, I hope. The barrels we got, but copper pipes and such, I'm going to have to send you elsewhere. Now you go to these fellers, and they should be able to meet your needs. Old Crow wrote down the names on a pad of paper. By the time you're done, your corn will be ready. We'll see you get fixed up proper. The two had struck a deal. That day and ever since, Pound Maker's Feed and Seed is the official supplier to the best still in town. Old Crow sent Spikes off to see our local inventor, Federico Macaroni, for the pipes and the makings for the still. And there he received similar treatment. Macaroni was more than helpful and equally non-judgmental. Once Macaroni understood Purvis's design and the purpose behind the design, he threw in some relief valves, pressure gauges, and other tools of the trade. The bootlegger proceeded to pick up empty bottles at O'Malley's Rathskeller Common Tavern. There he struck a deal to bring his product back and see if there was any further business that could be done. He found a mule named Sally at Ned's Nelly Emporium. When he got back to Poundmaker's Feed and Seed, he had entered into the office with far less rigidity than he had earlier in the day. Old Crow was no less friendly. "I watched you pull up. I see you took Sally. She's a nice old gal. But just a word of advice now," Old Crow winked. "Old Sally loves parsnips. Just keep them on hand and you two will be fast friends. I got the boys to throw in a few to get you started." Then Purvis Spikes articulated a phrase that he had not uttered in years. "Thank you." Old Crow nodded. "It's good doing business with you, and I hope you'll be back. Now, is there anything else we can do for you?" Spike looked at his boots. "My gut tells me not to press my luck, but there is one more thing." Old Crow waited and smiled. "Bob," he said. Old Crow nodded. "Make some folks feel more comfortable." "Well, Mr. Crow, truth be told, I would like a dog." "Who doesn't? Again, you're new here, Mr. Spikes, so I guess it's up to me to let you know. Nobody in town sells dogs, and they don't give away no pups." Spikes regretted the quest. Now Old Crow crossed the office floor and held Purvis Spikes around his bicep. "In Snake River, you'll find the dogs come to you." With that, Purvis shook off the embrace and headed for the door. "Fair enough," was all he said on the way out. Purvis checked the load on the cart. He tightened down the rope that held the copper pipes. He took a parsnip out of a bag and went to the front of the cart. There he looked at old Sally right in the eye. The mule adjusted her ears and looked back. Purvis thought she looked familiar. With her big ears and her sad eyes, she reminded him of an old prostitute he knew in Atlanta. "Tell me you like parsnips." Sally nodded. Purvis laughed. He realized that was the second rarity of the day. He had said thank you, and he had laughed. He shook his head and fed the mule the parsnip. Sally enjoyed the snack with great sound and saliva. Purvis Spikes mounted the cart, and without a shake of his reins or any motion at all, old Sally started to pull her new master and his load. Snake River is a typical prairie town, tediously flat. One exception to the grass and grain outside of the village is the Hurton Forest. Our German population has many a tale associated with these dense woods. The forest is full of stories of children being lured away with sweets, never to be seen again. The locals said the forest was thick with harpies, scallywags, and the like. It is true the Hurton Forest is a dark growth. The trees are mammoth and do block out the sun. It is true this forest is an easy place to get lost. As far as it being home to witches and dragons, we'll leave that to another book on another day. Spikes had been warned by some womenfolk that setting up a home in the forest was not a wise move. Spikes ignored the advice. The Hurton Forest was his destination. Sally led the cart to the edge of the forest, without any direction from her new owner. Once in the shadow of the great trees, she stopped. She turned back to look at Purvis, and with those big sad eyes full of question. "Come on, gal." Spikes made a clicking sound, and the mule didn't budge. "Don't be afraid, darling. You got old Purvis by your side." Spikes got off the cart and grabbed old Sally's bit. This time she came forward without hesitation. Maybe it's a good thing we go this way, Sal. The footing looks a mite precarious. But don't you be worried. Do you know I once led a company of Nathan Banks boys through woods just like this? It was me against 24 or more of them Yanks. Got them so turned around they didn't know if they were coming or going. Big boys, mind you. By the end of the week, I had 'em shaking in their boots and crying to their mamas. I would come and go, scoot and slither, till they just plumb gave up. There was a crack of wood, and old Sally tensed up and stopped dead in her tracks. Spikes and the mule turned around to look behind them. I think we're being followed. The two stared back at their tracks. Both the mule and the bootlegger had their ears pricked up. Ain't nothing but a gopher, I'd say. The bootlegger patted the mule on the neck, and the two started forward again. But now, not just 10 feet in front of them, right in their path sat a dog. All parties stood still. The mutt was a big fella. He appeared to be part wolf. One ear was bitten off, and his coat was a mess of tangled fur and ground up leaves. Spikes eyeballed the dog for some time, and then he finally spoke up. "Are you a good boy?" With that, the dog smiled, as dogs will, and the sound of his wagging tail, brushing the undergrowth, was a welcome relief to both the mule and the bootlegger. "Well, come here, then, you good boy." The dog bounded to Spikes and the mule. He rolled on his back and allowed Purvis to scratch his belly. Once Spikes stopped the action, the dog raced around the cart one more time, then lay down staring up at old Sally. The mule bent over and licked the dog's face with her gigantic tongue. "Well, I guess old Crow knows a thing or two." Spikes leaned over and scratched the dog behind his ear. "Okay, GB. I want to get a tent before nightfall." In one leap, the dog was in the seat of the cart. Purvis got up as well, although with less enthusiasm. As soon as the two were settled in, old Sally continued on deeper into the Hurton forest. And that's how it started. Purvis set up his still in the middle of these dark woods. Exactly where, not too many people know. Not too many people care. And it's just the way the bootlegger wanted it. The man came to Snake River to make booze and keep to himself. As far as the former is concerned, there are none better. The latter goal was less successful. It was never in the plans, but Spikes made some friends. The southern man was ill prepared for that first Saskatchewan winter. Late in the fall, he realizes he needed a place to bunk out overnight. Spikes made a deal with old Crow. He would serve as a night watchman for Pound Maker's feed and seed. Old Sally would sleep in the warehouse and would neigh if intruders entered through the back door. Purvis and GB would sleep in the office and keep an eye on the front door. He told old Crow, "Any man with such a fine establishment as this needs security. Pilferers and looters could ruin a business such as this." Old Crow agreed that until Purvis built himself a proper cabin in the forest, he would personally manage the company's overnight security. The thing was, there's no such crime in Snake River. The only thievery took place on the ice. Pop's Kiffle would rob snipers of goals. Hearts were stolen, and the odd trinket would be misplaced, but Purvis' security service was not really needed. Both men understood the arrangement, but never spoke of it directly. The next spring, old Crow gave Spikes a hand in building his cabin in the Hurton forest. Purvis Spikes had a home. Despite this move from the feed and seed To this day, Crow and Spikes meet 4 or 5 times a week over breakfast. These meetings are billed as security conferences, but they're really just two friends getting together. It did not take long for Purvis to develop a thriving business. He liked making booze, and Snake Riverians liked drinking booze. It was marriage made in heaven, or elsewhere. Spikes would joke to Crow about his early days back in the South. When I first started in the moonshine business, my southern customers had but one criteria. They told me to find a level where the booze could kill them and then dial it back 1%. This philosophy carried well to his northern clients. Like most success stories, his trade started small and grew to meet an ever-demanding market. He had been delivering his sour mash to O'Malley's with rave reviews. Phileas O'Malley used the same expression every time Purvis inquired about the reception his brew was getting. "Oh, it's just great there, laddie." The bar owner was enthusiastic. "Just great. Keep it coming." However, one day O'Malley took a different tone upon greeting Spikes. The barkeep, in his drunken, repetitive way, passed along the message that everyone really enjoyed the bourbon, but one very important customer made a request. Apparently the master libationist Bill Meadows had inquired about Spike's ability to make gin. O'Malley was apologetic in this request. However, Spikes took to the challenge like a fish to water. After some experimentation, he presented Spike's brand Grief Beater Gin. The potion lived up to its name. Bill Meadows was ecstatic. Once the word got out that Purvis was taking requests, the moonshiner was overrun with orders. Captain Andy Fellithsue wanted rum. Marky Mark Chagall loved his absinthe. Bill Mackenzie wanted scotch, and Mrs. Snooty P. Williams needed the bootlegger to produce sherry. Purvis, Spikes, and his still were more than up for the job. He has the highest customer satisfaction rating and is easily the most successful business in Snake River. There was no intoxicant that he could not master to the customer's satisfaction. However, he refused to make beer. This beverage was, and remains to be, supplied by Schultz and Dooley Stein. The brothers make a fine German dunkel, but many thought Spikes could outdo the established suds supplier. Spikes would not budge. Publicly, he told folks his old mule, Sally, just couldn't handle the extra weight the barrels of beer would require. He told his good friend Old Crow a more personal reason. In the South, I learned that if you piss on another man's lawn, there's a good chance you can get shot. Despite turning down the lucrative beer market, within 2 years, Purvis Spikes was the main supplier to O'Malley's Rathskeller Common Tavern. He made intoxicants that suited any palate. Gin, hard cider, and Oh Be Joyful are the staple of his business. But to this day, his signature brew is his Kentucky straight corn whiskey. Purvis Spikes Sipping Liquor No. 7. One day, the lawyer, Larson Frogpatter, told Purvis he should name his company. Larson insisted that one move would be the final step towards legitimacy. Within a couple of days, Spikes hung a sign over his front door. Spike's Stillery. Larson noted the word was actually distillery. Spikes replied, "No, it ain't." The bootlegger maintained enough of a potentially violent air that Larson ended the conversation right there. Once his business was in full production, the craft took most of Purvis Spike's waking hours. GB the dog was good company. He'd also learned to warn Spikes about an overboiled brew. Sally was a hard worker that never complained, but Spike's Stillery was still a one-man operation. That is, until one night. Purvis was sitting outside with GB and Sal. The threesome were sitting around a fire, quietly relaxing. Spikes was cooking up some beans. Sally was chewing her cud, and GB was half asleep, enjoying the warmth of the flames. On nights like this, GB had restrained himself not to bark at every critter that came within his scent or sound. Spikes had made himself clear. I don't need to be told every time a gopher gets near. And if it's a bear, then there ain't no sense getting the critter all riled up with your barking. I just need you to warn me of the presence of dangerous animals. And there ain't but one, them that carry themselves upright on two legs. GB understood. The Hurton forest was dark and unwelcoming, and most folks avoided the woods. Old Crow was about the only other Snake Riverian who knew where the still was located. He rarely came out unannounced, respecting his friend's privacy. Once in a blue moon, a lost bird watcher would stumble into Spike's camp. A whiskey jack or gray jay was often to blame, and the birder would be most embarrassed to be led so far astray by the trickster. On this night in question, it was an unusual act by GB. He let out one quick bark, but then began to wag his tail. Sally woke up from her slumber, and Purvis pricked his ears out to the dark woods beyond the light of the fire. "Who's there?" Old Crow never came out at night, and a lost bird watcher would usually start its apologies by now. But this was not the case. The undergrowth cracked as the stranger came close. "I said, who's there?" Spikes was more emphatic this time. He stood up and peered into the dark woods. Spikes found it odd that GB continued to wag his tail. The three just stood and listened as the human timidly cracked his way through the underbrush. Finally, into the light of the fire appeared a young boy. "It's me, sir. I'm nothing but a waif." "Your name, son?" The child put his eyes to the ground. He mumbled and gave a brief sob. Spike softened his voice. "Son, do you have a name that you can recollect?" The child lifted his head, and for the first time looked Spike's eye to eye. "Sir, I'm but a waif." The kid was as skinny as a rail. His clothes were dirty and well worn. The bags under his eyes told a story of strife that should have belonged to a man much older. He held his hat in his hands. "Well, son, this here dog's GB. That sorry mule there is Sally, and my name is Spikes. You want some beans? I got some bannock to soften the blow." "Sir, Mr. Spikes, Sally, GB." The waif's eyes darted between the bootlegger and his animals. "I want to work, sir. I don't need charity." "Well, if you're gonna work, you need to put some muscle on you. Looks like a slight breath of wind could knock you over. So sit down there. You eat, and we can negotiate." The lad tentatively took a seat by the fire. Once the plate of beans was placed in his hands, there was nothing tentative about the consumption of the food before him. Over the course of that dinner, Purvis Spikes proceeded to do something he thought he would never do. He took on an apprentice. The trio were now a quartet. The agreement came slowly. Neither Spikes nor the waif said much more than they felt necessary. Spikes did not need to know the boy's full history. Spikes thought about his own childhood and understood the waif's desire to keep quiet. "So that's the deal. I'll show you the tricks of the trade, as much as I know, in exchange for food and lodging." "That's more than fair, sir." "No, it's just fair and no more." Spikes winked and held out his hand. The The boy extended his hand for the first time in a long time. For both of them, they smiled. Okay, then. It's a deal. Now, I gotta call you something. So old Sally already had her name when I took her on. This here mutt, GB, well, I named him such cause for the most part. He's a good boy. The joke went over the dog's head, and the boy wasn't sure if it was polite to laugh. How about I call you Boy? B-A-W. That would be short for but a waif. It'll be our little secret. The waif nodded. That would be fine, sir. And that was that. GB seemed to seal the deal with a yelp and one spin around the fire like he was a pup again. The dog settled in at Ba's feet, and the two became fast friends that rarely parted. With Spike's southern accent, most Snake Riverians heard Ba as boy. Eventually old Crow was let in on the joke, and he made a great show of it every time the two met. In no time at all, the lad was a permanent fixture in the community. Ba was treated with the same respect the townsfolk gave to the bootlegger. The only acknowledgment to his tender disposition was given by the barkeep O'Malley. Their routine took some time to establish. Once a week, Spikes and the barkeep had to settle accounts. O'Malley wanted to keep the young lad out of his office. He told the boy, "It's time for a man's business." The secrecy behind the financial meetings was a ruse. In truth, the old barkeep was embarrassed about the large painting behind his desk. This gift from his most notable patron, Bill Meadows, depicted a woman in recline. She was a full-figured gal, completely in the buff. To avoid the embarrassment, O'Malley set up a seat for the boy in the kitchen, and with a great show he gave the lad a box of homemade Cracker Jacks and a bottle of sarsaparilla. The Irishman would slap the child on the back. He told Ba that he knew how hard he'd worked. He made it as clear as he could that the sugary delights were in recognition of his labors. It always seemed like Ba was on the verge of tears, and his reception to the gift was awkward at best. O'Malley would return to find the child had barely touched either the drink or the treat. Respecting Spike's privacy had been a trademark of the relationship, and took a great deal of strength to maintain. But O'Malley was at heart a sentimental old fool, and one day he could not take the rejection any longer. "Boy, tell me what ails you. Why, there isn't a lad in town that does not crave me Cracker Jacks. None except you. Why is it, son? We've got some fine pemmican out back if you prefer." The waif just looked down at the box of Cracker Jacks before him. "I'm sorry, Mr. O'Malley. The Cracker Jacks are a delight. And I mean no disrespect, sir." "Well, what is it, son? Why don't you—" The barkeep stopped talking, upon the sight of a tear rolling down the child's cheek. "What is it, son?" "Sir, Mr. Spikes advised me to seek honesty in all our business. He's told me that you are a fine, honest man in all our dealings, and you are to be treated with the utmost respect." The boy was sobbing hard, and the tears flew freely. O'Malley passed the lad his handkerchief, and felt terrible that he had opened some can of worms that he would later regret. "Oh, that's all right, son. It ain't none of my business. I'm sorry for prodding you like an old mule." "That's my situation, sir." The waif looked up at the barkeep for the first time in this exchange. "The Cracker Jacks just don't seem right because of that old mule." The barkeep was confused. "Go on." "Well, sir, you make such a great show about how these Cracker Jacks are reward for my hard work. It just don't seem right that I get these and the sarsaparilla. Sir, they are wonderful. I've never tasted anything like them ever, sir. But, well, sir, old Sally out there works hard as I do. Or harder. I just lift the crates to the wagon. She's the one that pulls them to town. And she's got to wait outside in the cold, sir, while I get these fine Cracker Jacks. And there ain't no better dog alive than GB. I swear to you, sir. Folks don't understand. Why, with his snout he can tell when a brew is too hot or too cold. And a better friend a boy never had than that old hound GB. With that, the waif broke down in a puddle of tears, and the old barkeep wasn't too far behind. There, son, no need to carry on. 'Twas my mistake. You are correct, sir. And I am but an old fool, a blind old fool. But it's not too late. I do seek redress if you would only forgive me. With that, the waif hugged O'Malley around his legs and wiped his tears away on the old man's pants. Adjustments were made, and now the routine is set. When it's time for man's business, O'Malley takes care of the Spikes crew first. He sets up the mule, the boy, and his dog in his carriage shop, where he can accommodate them all. There's a stall with a fresh straw to lay upon. Old Sally settles in first, then GB and the ba tuck in right alongside the old mule. Every week Sally gets to munch on a dozen or so parsnips. GB gets a fresh stewing bone to chew on, and ba finally gets to enjoy his Cracker Jacks and sarsaparilla. In no time the quartet found their stride. They worked hard at their craft all day and took a proper rest in the evening. Under direction and guidance of Spikes, ba got a library card, a document he cherished like it was the original Magna Carta. Most every night the waif would read aloud to his new family. Moby Dick, 20,000 Leagues Underneath the Sea, and The Count of Monte Cristo were all-time favorites. They started to read Oliver Twist, but found the story too painful. Spikes and the boy digested these adventures in a certain sense to tell their own stories. With time's healing aspect, there became a great understanding between the two. Both decided that they had seen enough adventures in their lives. The waif described far-off lands, tropical islands, and magical fields, and both he and Spikes discussed these matters with no jealousy whatsoever. There was nothing better now than a good honest day's work, a fine simple meal, and a comfortable pallet to lay your head on. The great adventures could be dreamt of during a nap on Sunday afternoon. Then the dream would be swept away.